In the gilded cage of a Manhattan penthouse, a mafia boss discovered his daughter's salvation in the arms of a woman society told him to overlook. And in that forbidden moment of maternal defiance, three lives collided with enough force to either shatter an empire or rebuild it from something stronger than blood and power combined. The thing about power, Marco Valentino had learned, was that it insulated you from almost everything except your own failures. Tonight, standing in the marbled hallway of his Upper East Side penthouse, he could feel failure breathing down his neck like a contract killer he'd somehow missed on the security cameras. Isabella was crying again. The sound pierced through 12-inch thick walls, past the Monet hanging in the corridor, beyond the bulletproof windows that kept the world at bay, and straight into the part of Marco's chest where he'd buried his heart 3 weeks ago alongside his wife. The doctors called it colic. Marco called it torture. The universe's way of reminding him that all his money, all his connections, all the blood on his hands couldn't solve the simplest problem. His daughter was starving, and he was powerless to stop it. He checked his Patek Philippe, 11:47 p.m. Another night of Isabella's screaming, another night of watching his infant daughter reject every bottle, every formula, every goddamn solution the parade of specialists had suggested. At this rate, he'd need to start intimidating pediatricians, though he suspected even his reputation couldn't scare answers out of people who genuinely didn't have them. Marco loosened his tie, Hermes, blood red, still carrying the faint smell of cigar smoke from tonight's meeting with the Calabrese family. The meeting had gone well, considering Paulo Calabrese had spent the entire evening testing whether Marco's grief had made him weak, whether Sophia's death had left cracks in the Valentino empire that could be exploited. Marco had answered those unspoken questions by casually mentioning that he knew about Paulo's youngest son's gambling debts, the ones Paulo thought he'd kept hidden. Nothing direct, nothing threatening, just enough information to remind everyone in that room that Marco Valentino still had eyes everywhere and a memory like a steel trap. But none of that mattered now, because his daughter was crying, and he couldn't make it stop. He started toward the nursery, his footsteps silent on the Persian runner, old habits from his days doing field work before he'd inherited the family business from his father. The old man had taught him to move like smoke, to read a room before entering it, to trust his instincts even when they contradicted logic. Right now, his instincts were screaming that something was wrong. Actually, scratch that. His instincts were whispering that something was right, which was infinitely more disturbing. Because Isabella wasn't crying anymore. For the first time in 3 weeks, his daughter was silent. Marco's hand moved instinctively to his side, fingers brushing the absence where his Beretta usually rested. He'd left it in the safe tonight, a concession to having staff in the house, to maintaining some threadbare illusion of normalcy. Now he regretted it. The nursery door stood slightly ajar, warm light spilling into the darkened hallway. Marco approached it the way he'd approach any potentially hostile situation, carefully, quietly, every sense alert. He could hear something now, a low humming, melodic and gentle. Not Isabella, someone else. Grace. Marco eased the door open another inch, positioning himself so he could see into the room without being immediately visible himself. What he saw made him freeze mid-breath, his entire world narrowing to the scene unfolding in the rocking chair by the window. Grace Morrison sat bathed in the golden glow of the lamp, her uniform, that crisp gray dress with white collar that made her look like she'd stepped out of some vintage photograph, unbuttoned at the top. His daughter, Isabella, 3 months old and weighing far too little, nursed peacefully at Grace's breast. For a moment, Marco couldn't process it. His brain, trained to calculate odds and assess threats in microseconds, simply stalled out. Grace's eyes were half closed, her expression distant and peaceful, one hand supporting Isabella's head while the other rested on the arm of the chair. She was humming something, a lullaby maybe, or a hymn, something old, something that sounded like it carried generations of memory in its notes. Isabella looked content. More than content, she looked healthy, pink-cheeked, and peaceful in a way Marco hadn't seen since before Sophia's accident. His daughter's tiny hand rested against Grace's skin, fingers spread like a starfish, utterly trusting and secure. It was beautiful. It was impossible. It was completely unauthorized. And it was saving his daughter's life. Marco felt something crack inside his chest, some carefully constructed wall he'd built between himself and the world. He'd seen men die. He'd killed men himself when necessary. Always clean, always justified within the brutal mathematics of his world. He'd watched his wife's casket lowered into the ground while holding his infant daughter, and somehow kept his face neutral, because showing weakness in his position was an invitation for wolves to circle. But this utterly simple act of kindness, this unauthorized mercy that Grace had apparently been providing for God knows how long, this threatened to undo him completely. He must have made some sound, some involuntary intake of breath, because Grace's eyes snapped open and found him instantly in the window's reflection. Marco watched the realization hit her like a physical blow. The color drained from her face, her body went rigid, and her arms instinctively tightened around Isabella in a protective gesture that was equal parts maternal and terrified. For a long moment, they stared at each other through the reflection. Grace in the chair, Marco in the doorway, Isabella oblivious between them. The moment stretched, taut as a tripwire, pregnant with possibilities that ranged from gratitude to violence, neither of which Marco could quite access through the fog of exhaustion and shock. Finally, Marco stepped into the room fully, closing the door behind him with a quiet click that somehow sounded louder than a gunshot. Grace flinched but didn't look away from his reflection. Her jaw set in a way that suggested she'd already made her peace with whatever consequences were coming.
Mr. Valentino. Her voice barely rose above a whisper, hoarse with emotion. I can explain. Can you? Marco heard his own voice, soft and deadly, the tone he used in negotiations when he wanted the other party to understand that screaming would have been kinder, would have at least given them warning. He moved further into the room, aware that his presence filled the space, made it smaller, made Grace's options shrink with each step. Because I'm standing here trying to decide whether you're the bravest woman I've ever met or the most foolish. Grace lifted her chin, a gesture of defiance that surprised him. Her hands still trembled slightly where they held Isabella, but her eyes, dark brown, shot through with gold in the lamplight, met his with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. Your daughter was starving, Mr. Valentino. The words were simple, matter-of-fact, completely devastating. Marco felt them land like body blows, each syllable a small indictment of his failure as a father, as a protector, as a man who'd built an empire on his ability to solve problems. So, you took it upon yourself to— Marco gestured at the scene, momentarily at a loss for words. In his world, people didn't improvise. They followed orders. They stayed in their lanes. They understood their place in the hierarchy. Grace had blown past all those unspoken rules, had made a decision that should have been his to make, and had kept it secret for— how long? 3 days. Grace's voice gained strength, though it still shook slightly. She wasn't just rejecting formula, Mr. Valentino. She was failing to thrive. Another 48 hours and you'd have been— She stopped, bit her lip, seemed to recalculate. Isabella needed help. I could provide it. So I did. Do you have any idea what people would say if they knew? Marco moved to the window, needing to put some distance between himself and the raw vulnerability of the scene. Outside, Manhattan glittered, indifferent to domestic dramas playing out in its expensive towers. What they'd assume about you, about me, about this. He waved vaguely at the nursery, at the situation that defied easy categorization. That I saved your daughter's life? Grace's voice took on an edge, indignation cutting through fear. Because that's what I did. I'm not going to apologize for it. I'm not asking you to apologize. Marco turned back to face her, and something in his expression must have shifted, because Grace's defiance faltered slightly. I'm trying to understand why you'd take this risk. You work for one of the most dangerous men in New York. You had to know that if I found out. If you found out, you'd what? Fire me? Kill me? Grace's laugh was brittle, edged with hysteria. Mr. Valentino, I've spent the last 8 months wishing I was dead. You'd have been doing me a favor. The words hung in the air like smoke, heavy with implications Marco wasn't prepared to unpack. He studied Grace more carefully now, really looked at her for the first time since hiring her 6 weeks ago. She was younger than he'd thought initially, 28 according to her file, but grief had added years to her eyes, carved shadows beneath her cheekbones, left her with the hollow look of someone who'd survived something unsurvivable. "Tell me," Marco said quietly, and it wasn't a request. Grace looked down at Isabella, who'd finished nursing and now dozed against her chest, milk-drunk and peaceful. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I lost my daughter 8 months ago. Premature birth, 26 weeks. They tried everything, every intervention, every miracle of modern medicine." She paused, and Marco watched a tear slide down her cheek, catch the lamplight, disappear into the fabric of her uniform. "Maya lived for 3 hours. I got to hold her once, just once." Marco felt something shift in his chest, some fundamental recalibration of how he saw the woman in front of him. Not just the nanny, not just the hired help, a mother, a grieving mother who'd lost everything. "My milk came in anyway," Grace continued, her voice thick with bitterness. 4 days after Maya died, right on schedule. The lactation consultant at the hospital called it nature's cruel joke. I called it hell. My body producing food for a baby who'd never need it, who'd never... Her voice broke, and she stopped, visibly collecting herself. "When I saw Isabella struggling, when I held her at 2 in the morning while she screamed from hunger, she was too exhausted to even cry about properly, I thought about Maya. I thought about what I'd have given for someone to help her, to save her." Grace looked up at Marco then, her eyes fierce despite the tears. "So I did what I'd have wanted someone to do for me. I did what any mother would do." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by Isabella's soft breathing and the distant sound of traffic 20 stories below. Marco found himself unable to move, unable to speak, caught between too many conflicting impulses: anger at the presumption, gratitude for the intervention, grief for the loss they now apparently shared. He thought about Sophia, about those last moments in the hospital when the doctors had told him there was nothing more they could do, when he'd had to make the choice to let her go. He'd understood then, in a way he'd never understood before, that there were some problems money couldn't solve, some enemies even he couldn't defeat. Death had shown him the limits of his power, had stripped away every illusion of control he'd built his life around. "The agency doesn't know," Marco said finally. It wasn't a question, but Grace shook her head anyway. "No one knows. Just you and me." And if word got out? Marco moved closer now, his voice dropping to the low register he used when discussing business that couldn't be discussed in public. "My enemies would use this. They'd twist it, weaponize it, say I can't even feed my own child, that I'm weak, that the Valentino family is vulnerable." "Are you?" Grace asked, and there was genuine curiosity in her voice now, stripped of fear. "Weak for accepting help when your daughter needs it, or weak for caring more about your reputation than her life?" It was the second time tonight someone had questioned his priorities. The first had been Paolo Calabrese, testing whether grief had made Marco sloppy. But Paolo's questions had been predatory, searching for weakness to exploit. Grace's question felt different, more like an invitation to examine what strength actually meant.
A laugh escaped Marco before he could stop it. Short, sharp, utterly without humor. Most people are too terrified to even make eye contact with me. You're nursing my daughter while questioning my masculinity? I'm questioning your priorities, Mr. Valentino. There's a difference. Grace shifted Isabella slightly, adjusting the baby's position with practiced ease. I've already lost everything that mattered. You can't threaten me with anything worse than what I've already lived through. So yes, I did this without asking permission, and yes, I'd do it again, because your daughter was dying and I could help. Fire me if you want, call the police, do whatever you need to do, but Isabella is alive and thriving, and that's worth whatever consequences come next. Marco studied her for a long moment. This woman who'd somehow managed to become essential to his daughter's survival in a matter of days, who'd taken risks that should have terrified her, who'd looked at his reputation and his power and decided they mattered less than an infant's hunger. There was a strength in Grace that had nothing to do with physical power or social capital, the kind of strength his mother had possessed, the kind that survived poverty and violence and loss, and somehow still chose kindness. Isabella stirred slightly in Grace's arms, making a small sound of contentment before settling back into sleep. She looked healthier than she had in weeks, her color better, her breathing easy, her tiny body finally relaxed instead of racked with the tension of constant hunger. Grace had saved his daughter, had done it quietly, without fanfare, without asking for anything in return, had risked her job, her reputation, possibly her life to feed a child who wasn't hers. Marco thought about his own mother again, about the stories she'd told him of raising children in Brooklyn while his father was building the empire Marco now controlled. She'd once told him, "The strongest men know when to let someone else be strong for them. Pride is expensive, mio figlio. Sometimes you can't afford it." He'd been too young to understand then. He understood now. "You'll stay," Marco said. His voice had lost its edge, replaced with something softer, more certain. "You'll move into the East Wing, full-time. I can't have you coming and going at odd hours. Too many eyes on this house. Too many people who ask questions I don't want to answer." Grace's eyes widened. "Mr. Valentino!" "You'll have your own suite, complete privacy, whatever you need to be comfortable. And your salary triples, effective immediately." Marco held up a hand when she started to protest. "I'm not asking what you want, Grace. I'm telling you what's going to happen. You saved my daughter's life. That makes you invaluable. That makes you family. And in my world, family is everything." He watched Grace process this, saw the emotions flicker across her face. Surprise, relief, confusion, and something that might have been hope, carefully guarded and fragile as spun glass. "What do I tell people?" she asked finally. "Your staff, your associates?" "You tell them nothing. As far as anyone knows, you're Isabella's nanny. That's all they need to know." Marco moved closer, close enough to see the exhaustion in Grace's eyes, the weight she'd been carrying. "But between us, you're the person who kept my daughter alive when I couldn't. You gave her what I couldn't provide. That's a debt I can never repay, Grace, but I can make sure you're protected, taken care of, safe." Grace looked down at Isabella, her expression unreadable. Maya would have been 3 months old now, same as Isabella. The words hit Marco like a confession, like a prayer, like an explanation for everything that had just happened. He reached out slowly, giving Grace time to pull away if she wanted to, and gently touched Isabella's hand. His daughter's tiny fingers wrapped around his pinky with surprising strength, and Marco felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. Then, he said quietly, "This is how we honor her memory, by making sure Isabella lives, by being strong enough to accept help, by," he paused, searching for words adequate to the moment, "by building something good out of all this loss." Grace looked up at him then, really looked at him, and Marco saw her make some decision behind her eyes, some leap of faith that probably wasn't wise but felt inevitable anyway. "Okay," she whispered, "I'll stay." "Good." Marco stepped back, suddenly aware of how intimate the moment had become, how far they'd strayed from the careful hierarchies that usually governed his world. "Move your things in tomorrow. I'll have Antonio help with logistics, but I'll tell him you're staying on as full-time staff. He doesn't need details. And if he asks questions? Antonio has worked for me for 15 years. He knows better than to ask questions." Marco moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. "Grace, thank you. For being brave when I didn't know we needed bravery. He gestured vaguely at Isabella, at the scene they'd just navigated. "For all of it." Grace nodded, tears streaming freely down her face now, making no attempt to hide them. "You're welcome, Mr. Valentino." Marco left the nursery, closing the door quietly behind him, and stood in the hallway trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 10 minutes, his entire world had shifted on its axis. He'd discovered a secret that should have ended in someone's termination or worse, and instead, he'd just expanded his household and essentially made a stranger part of his inner circle. His father would have called it sloppy. His associates would call it weakness. Marco called it survival. Not his own, but Isabella's. And in the end, wasn't that what mattered? He pulled out his phone and sent a quick text to Antonio. "East Wing Guest Suite. Prepare it for permanent occupancy. Grace Morrison moving in tomorrow. Tell no one." The response came back almost immediately. "Understood, boss." Marco pocketed the phone and headed toward his study, knowing sleep was impossible now, knowing he had too much to think about, too many calculations to run about what this decision would cost him and what it might gain. But as he poured himself 3 fingers of Macallan and settled into the leather chair behind his desk, Marco found himself thinking not about strategy or risk management, but about the look on Isabella's face as she'd slept against Grace's chest. Peaceful, safe, alive. Sometimes, he thought, power meant knowing when to surrender control. Sometimes strength looked like accepting help. Sometimes the best decision was the one that kept your daughter breathing. Consequences be damned. Outside his study window, Manhattan glittered in the darkness, an empire of steel and glass and ambition that Marco commanded with an iron fist. But upstairs, in a nursery bathed in lamplight, 2 women, one alive, one lost, were teaching him that there were other kinds of power, other ways to be strong. And maybe, just maybe, that was the lesson he'd needed to learn all along.
Grace Morrison had lived in 7 different places over the past 8 months, each one smaller and more depressing than the last. After Maya's death, she'd lost the apartment she'd shared with her boyfriend, ex-boyfriend now, since apparently infant mortality was too much emotional baggage for a 29-year-old personal trainer to handle. She'd bounced between her sister's couch in Queens, a sublet in Washington Heights that smelled perpetually of curry and regret, and finally a room in a boarding house in the Bronx where the landlady asked too many questions and the walls were thin enough to hear every argument, every heartbreak, every moment of other people's lives continuing while hers had stopped. Now she stood in the East Wing guest suite of Marco Valentino's penthouse, surrounded by more luxury than she'd seen in her entire life, and felt absolutely nothing. The suite was larger than any apartment she'd ever rented. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Central Park, the trees just beginning to show hints of autumn color. The furniture looked European, expensive, the kind of pieces that appeared in magazines Grace had stopped reading because they represented a life she'd never have. There was a sitting area with a cream-colored sofa, a bedroom with a king-sized bed that could sleep 4 people comfortably, and a bathroom done in marble that probably cost more than her nursing degree. Antonio had helped her move her things in this morning, a process that had taken all of 15 minutes because Grace's entire life now fit into 2 suitcases and a cardboard box. He'd been professional, efficient, and completely incurious about why the nanny was suddenly getting accommodations that rivaled visiting dignitaries. Marco had trained his people well. "Ms. Morrison?"
Antonio stood in the doorway, his silver hair perfectly combed, his posture military straight despite being at least 60. Mr. Valentino asked me to inform you that Isabella typically wakes around 2 p.m. for her feeding. He's arranged his schedule to be out of the penthouse during those times to give you privacy. Grace turned from the window, surprised. He doesn't need to do that. Nevertheless, those are his instructions. Antonio's expression remained neutral, but something in his eyes suggested he knew more than he was saying. The kitchen is fully stocked. Chef Carmine has been instructed to prepare whatever you need whenever you need it. You have full access to the penthouse except Mr. Valentino's private study and the master suite. If you require anything at all, you can reach me on extension 3. Thank you, Antonio. The older man nodded, started to leave, then paused. Ms. Morrison, Mr. Valentino is a good man. He doesn't always show it, but he is. What you're doing for Isabella... He stopped, seemed to reconsider his words. It matters, more than you might realize. Before Grace could respond, Antonio was gone, closing the door quietly behind him and leaving her alone in her gilded cage. Grace sank onto the sofa, suddenly exhausted despite having done nothing but move boxes and accept instructions. The suite was beautiful, yes, but it felt like a museum, perfect, pristine, utterly devoid of life. She thought about her old apartment, the one she'd shared with Derek before everything fell apart. It had been cramped, and the radiator clanked, and the neighbors upstairs fought every Thursday like clockwork, but it had been hers. It had been home. This was just another place to haunt. Her phone buzzed, a text from her sister Janelle. Mom wants to know when you're coming for Sunday dinner. She's worried about you. Grace typed back, "Tell her I'm fine. New job keeping me busy." The response came immediately. "Grace, you can't keep avoiding us. We love you. We want to help." "I know. I love you too. Just need some time." Grace silenced her phone and tossed it onto the cushion beside her. She knew her family meant well, but their concern felt suffocating, like drowning in good intentions. Her mother kept trying to feed her, as if food could fill the hole where Maya used to be. Janelle kept sending her links to grief support groups and therapists who specialized in infant loss. Her father had stopped talking altogether, just looked at her with such profound sadness that Grace wanted to shake him and scream that she was still alive, still here, still his daughter. But was she? Sometimes Grace felt like she died right alongside Maya, that she was just a ghost, going through the motions, doing all the things living people did, but feeling none of it. Except when she held Isabella. That was the strange, unexpected truth of the past 3 days. When Grace held Marco Valentino's daughter, when she felt that small body relax against her chest, when Isabella's breathing synchronized with her own, those were the only moments Grace felt anything close to alive. It was borrowed life, second-hand motherhood, but it was something. It was enough. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Grace stood quickly, smoothing her uniform. She'd changed into a fresh one after moving in, maintaining some semblance of professionalism, even though the entire situation had blown past professional weeks ago. "Come in." The door opened to reveal a young woman, maybe 25, with dark hair pulled into a severe bun and the kind of posture that suggested either ballet training or militant Catholic school. She carried a tablet and wore the expression of someone who'd seen everything and been impressed by none of it. "Ms. Morrison, I'm Lucia, Mr. Valentino's personal assistant. I wanted to go over some logistics with you regarding your new position." "My position hasn't changed," Grace said carefully. "I'm still Isabella's nanny." Lucia's smile was knowing, almost amused. "Of course. Nevertheless, there are some adjustments to discuss. May I sit?" Grace gestured to the sofa, and Lucia settled with the efficiency of someone who wasted neither time nor words. She pulled up something on her tablet, scrolled through it quickly. "Your salary has been adjusted, as Mr. Valentino indicated. Direct deposit, bi-weekly. You'll also have access to a household account for any expenses related to Isabella's care. Clothes, supplies, whatever she needs. Don't economize. Mr. Valentino values quality." Lucia glanced up. "He also values discretion." "I understand." "I'm not sure you do." Lucia's voice remained pleasant, but something sharpened beneath it. Mr. Valentino's world is complicated. There are people who would love nothing more than to find something they could use against him. Anything unusual about his personal life, anything that could be twisted or misinterpreted, it becomes ammunition. Grace felt her stomach tighten. "I would never—" "I'm not accusing you of anything, Ms. Morrison. I'm simply explaining reality." Lucia set down her tablet, and her expression softened slightly. "Mr. Valentino trusts very few people. The fact that you're here, in this suite, with access to his daughter, that means something. That means he's decided you're trustworthy. Don't make him regret it." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Grace thought about running, about packing her 2 suitcases and disappearing back into the anonymous poverty of the Bronx, where nobody cared who she was or what she did. But then she thought about Isabella, about that tiny face relaxed in sleep, about finally having a purpose again. "I understand," Grace said firmly. "Isabella's safety and Mr. Valentino's privacy are my priorities." Lucia studied her for a moment, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "Good. Now there are a few more things. Mr. Valentino entertains occasionally, business associates, family members. During these times, you're to keep Isabella in the nursery or here in your suite. You don't interact with guests unless specifically instructed. Of course. There's a security detail that monitors the building 24/7. You'll see them, they'll see you, but you don't acknowledge them and they won't bother you. They're there to protect Mr. Valentino and his family, which now includes you, by extension." Grace blinked. "I'm not family." "No," Lucia agreed, "but you're caring for Isabella, which makes you important to Mr. Valentino, which makes you someone we protect. It's not personal, Miss Morrison, it's pragmatic." She stood, smoothing her skirt. "One more thing. Mr. Valentino has enemies, people who would hurt him by hurting the people he cares about. If anyone approaches you outside this building, anyone who asks questions about your job or Mr. Valentino or Isabella, you don't answer. You don't engage. You call Antonio immediately. Understood?" "Understood." Grace's mouth felt dry. She'd known abstractly that Marco Valentino was dangerous, that his world operated by different rules, but Lucia's warning made it concrete in a way that sent ice down her spine. "Excellent." Lucia's professional smile returned. "Welcome to the household, Miss Morrison. I think you'll find Mr. Valentino is a generous employer, as long as loyalty is maintained." After Lucia left, Grace sat alone in the suite, processing everything she'd just learned. She'd accepted this position, this expanded live-in position, because of Isabella, because she couldn't bear the thought of that baby starving, because feeding Marco's daughter was the only thing that made her own milk meaningful instead of just another cruel reminder of loss. But she was beginning to understand that she'd also walked into something much larger and more dangerous than she'd anticipated. Marco Valentino wasn't just a wealthy businessman with questionable connections. He was something else entirely. Someone powerful enough to need armed security. Someone whose enemies would target the people around him. Someone whose trust came with invisible strings attached. Grace thought about Maya, about those 3 precious hours she'd gotten to hold her daughter before the machines flatlined and the doctors said their clinical condolences, and life as she knew it ended. She thought about the grief group she'd attended exactly once, where a woman had said, "Eventually, you find reasons to keep living, small ones at first, but they add up." Isabella was Grace's reason. This complicated, dangerous, utterly unconventional arrangement was her reason. Maybe it wasn't healthy. Maybe a therapist would say she was substituting Isabella for Maya, avoiding her grief instead of processing it. Maybe her sister was right that she needed proper help. But when Isabella nursed, when that tiny body relaxed against Grace's chest, when she felt needed and necessary and useful again, that was the only time the crushing weight of loss lifted enough for Grace to breathe. So she'd stay. She'd follow the rules, maintain discretion, pretend to be just the nanny while secretly being something else entirely. She'd exist in this strange liminal space between employee and family, between hired help and something more intimate. Because the alternative was going back to that boarding house in the Bronx, back to the emptiness, back to waking up every morning and forgetting for just a moment that Maya was gone, before remembering all over again. This arrangement might be complicated. It might be dangerous, but it was also the first thing in 8 months that felt like survival instead of just not dying. Grace stood and moved to the window, looking out at Central Park, spread below like a green promise. Somewhere out there, people were living normal lives, going to work, having coffee, complaining about subway delays and bad dates and all the mundane problems of existence. Grace had lived that life once. She couldn't imagine ever living it again. But maybe she could live this one, this strange, borrowed life in Marco Valentino's penthouse, caring for a daughter who wasn't hers, existing in the orbit of a man whose power terrified and fascinated her in equal measure. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Janelle. "Mom made your favorite, jerk chicken. Come home, Gracie." Grace typed back slowly, "I am home," or close enough. She hit send before she could reconsider, then turned her phone face down on the table and went to check on Isabella. The baby was still sleeping, tiny fists curled against her cheeks, completely innocent of the complicated world she'd been born into. "Your daddy's dangerous," Grace whispered, running a gentle finger down Isabella's soft cheek. "Your world is dangerous, but I'll keep you safe. I promise." It was a promise Grace had no business making, given that she couldn't even keep herself safe from her own grief. But she meant it anyway, because sometimes survival meant finding someone else to protect. Sometimes healing meant giving what you'd lost. Sometimes motherhood meant loving someone else's child like they were your own. Consequences be damned. Grace settled into the rocking chair, content to watch Isabella sleep, to memorize the curve of her cheek and the flutter of her eyelids and the sound of her breathing. Outside, Manhattan lived and breathed and moved according to its own ruthless rhythms. Grace had lived that life once. She couldn't imagine ever living it again. But maybe she could live this one, this strange, borrowed life in Marco Valentino's penthouse, caring for a daughter who wasn't hers, existing in the orbit of a man whose power terrified and fascinated her in equal measure. Her phone buzzed again. Another text from Janelle. "Mom made your favorite, jerk chicken. Come home, Gracie." Grace typed back slowly, "I am home," or close enough. She hit send before she could reconsider, then turned her phone face down on the table and went to check on Isabella. The baby was still sleeping, tiny fists curled against her cheeks, completely innocent of the complicated world she'd been born into. "Your daddy's dangerous," Grace whispered, running a gentle finger down Isabella's soft cheek. "Your world is dangerous, but I'll keep you safe. I promise." It was a promise Grace had no business making, given that she couldn't even keep herself safe from her own grief. But she meant it anyway, because sometimes survival meant finding someone else to protect. Sometimes healing meant giving what you'd lost. Sometimes motherhood meant loving someone else's child like they were your own. Consequences be damned. Grace settled into the rocking chair, content to watch Isabella sleep, to memorize the curve of her cheek and the flutter of her eyelids and the sound of her breathing. Outside, Manhattan lived and breathed and moved according to its own ruthless rhythms. But in this nursery, in this moment, Grace found something close to peace.
Marco Valentino's world operated on carefully maintained boundaries. There were the legitimate businesses, real estate holdings, import-export operations, a chain of restaurants that actually turned a profit. Then there were the less legitimate enterprises, the gambling operations, the protection rackets, the money laundering networks that kept cash flowing like blood through arteries. And finally, there was family, the sacred, untouchable center of everything, the reason all the other pieces existed. For the past 3 weeks, those boundaries had been bleeding into each other in ways that made Marco uneasy. Grief had a way of smudging lines that were supposed to stay sharp. Now, sitting in his study at midnight with a glass of scotch and a headache that wouldn't quit, Marco was realizing that inviting Grace Morrison into his home full-time might have just blown those boundaries to hell entirely. His phone buzzed. A text from Vincent Russo, his second-in-command. "Calabrese making noise about the Brooklyn territory. Wants a meeting." Marco typed back. "Set it up. Neutral ground. Next week." "You sure? Could be a trap." "Everything's a trap, Vincent. That's why we bring more guns than they do." Marco set down his phone and took another sip of scotch, feeling the burn settle into his chest. Paulo Calabrese was becoming a problem. The old man controlled most of Staten Island and had been making moves toward Brooklyn ever since Sophia's death, testing whether Marco's grief had made him vulnerable. It hadn't, but Marco's preoccupation with Isabella's health had definitely made him distracted, which, in his world, amounted to the same thing.